in a fast-paced culture, do we not? It is probably faster than any culture in the history of the world. We are a part of the fastest-paced culture ever. And it seems like it is getting faster all the time. With every new technological invention, we are propelled forward and everything gets faster and faster. And I think we often take this for granted because this has not been the case for the vast majority of human history. People have not lived in a culture where things go fast, where things spread fast, where things are propelled quickly. In fact, most the history of human culture, everything goes at the pace of a glacier. Like it just is barely moving along. And that is why the events surrounding the life of Paul are so intriguing to us. Is because how is this man over 2,000 years ago, how did everything happen so fast? I mean, you think about it, from the death of Christ until he was killed, less than 30 years goes by. And everything in the Roman Empire had changed. And so it's a fascinating thing because this energetic, talkative man from a despised race went from city to city talking about the one true God and His Son Jesus. He was setting up communities of believers who believed that Jesus was the true Messiah. He wrote letters to these communities and he completely transformed the Roman Empire all within less than 30 years. What he said about Jesus, what he said about God, what he said about the world would quite literally change the entirety of human history at an amazing rate of speed. This raises all kinds of questions for historians. Historians ask all types of questions like, how did this happen? How in the world was everything in the world changed so quickly? What did Paul have that others didn't? What did he think he was doing, and why was he doing it? This is in part the questions that this series is going to try to answer. We want to get inside the heart, get inside the mind, the ambition of this man that we call Paul. Questions will lead to next questions. So we'll ask a question and we'll answer it, and that'll pose another question, and we'll have to go from there. And instead of saying we're going to do a study on Paul, let's look at his 13 letters. We're actually going to do the opposite. What we're going to do is we're going to look at his life, his travels, his ministry. We'll bring the letters into it as we do more of a biographical study. So we're going to study his life, and as we go along, we're going to be grabbing from the books that he wrote, grabbing from his letters and pull them all together. And one question will lead to another one. Paul, it seems like, was headed in one direction as fast as he could go. He was a man whose life got totally changed. Why this change? What exactly happened on the road to Damascus that made this massive change in his life? Again, those are the kinds of things that we're going to deal with. So tonight what I want to do is I want us to, this is basically an introduction. We're going to talk about kind of a couple of big broad things that we need to kind of set the framework for Paul going forward. And then I want us to go to Tarsus, and I want us to look a little bit about what his life would have been like and growing up, and what would he have been in regards to his occupation, and so what would his life look like in Tarsus, and then that will help us springboard forward into the rest of his life. This first point is an important question. Was Paul a convert? Was Paul a convert? We have, it's proverbial now, but a Damascus Road experience. You know, that's become a proverbial statement. And what we mean by that is somebody was headed one way, they had a Damascus Road experience, and now they're doing the opposite of what they were doing. And this applies to religion, it applies to political conversions, it applies to so many different things when we're talking about someone who is going in one direction and now everything is transformed and they go the other direction. But strictly speaking, when we think about Paul, we're actually not talking about conversion the way that most people think about it. The way that we may say a person was converted from Buddhism to Christianity. Or the way that we say a person was converted from atheism to Christianity. We really can't use that kind of language when we're talking about Paul. Paul wasn't converted in that sense. Many have assumed that on the road to Damascus, Saul of Tarsus was converted from Judaism to something different. Okay, this is an important point because most people think he was a Jewish man who was following Yahweh and he was a part of the Jewish tradition, and then he got converted from Judaism to what we now call Christianity. But I think that if we think that way, we are missing a lot of what Paul is trying to say and what Paul is trying to do. Paul was a Jew, no doubt about it. Okay, Paul was a Jew. He had even become a teacher of Jewish tradition and the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible. This was his life. This was his activity. But what happens to Paul and what Paul became was not about switching people from Judaism to Christianity, but to help people see that in following Jesus Christ and announcing that Israel's God had raised Jesus from the dead, he was actually being loyal to his ancestral traditions, though in a way that nobody anticipated. So we need to get our mind around this. Paul did not see himself as a man who got converted from Judaism to Christianity. He believed that Christianity was God's plan for the Jewish nation. So Paul did not have to say, I no longer am a part of Judaism. He now believed that the end of Judaism was Christianity. So we got to think about conversion properly here when we're dealing with Paul. Don't think he went from Judaism to Christianity. Think that what he did is that he was following the Jewish ancestral traditions, and he found all their yes and amen in Christ. Paul will, as we will see throughout this series, Paul will argue over and over and over again, I am a loyal Jew. Right. You will see it over and over and over again. I am a loyal Jew. The switch is that none of us anticipated what a loyal Jew would look like. But now that Jesus has come, that means something different. So that's the first point I wanted to start off with tonight. Don't think of Paul as converting from Judaism to Christianity. Here's another question, and it's really a statement with a little question. When do we all get to heaven? Another barrier that stands in the way from people understanding Paul is that many Christians, especially in the West, not as much in the East, but especially in the West, many Christians believe the whole point of Christianity is for people to go to heaven when they die. If you are thinking that Paul's goal, that his ministry was all about getting people to go to heaven when they die, you will miss Paul completely. That's not what Paul was doing. What happens is a lot of our hymns, a lot of our prayers, a lot of our sermons in the West seem to point that direction. It even seems that way with Paul when Paul says that we are citizens of heaven. We read words like saved and glorified, and in our minds that immediately means we're in heaven. That the whole point of being saved and the whole point of being glorified, it was that we're off of earth and we're in this glorious heavenly place forever and ever and ever. But Paul did not view himself, and he did not view his family in Christ, primarily as saved souls being rescued from the world and taken to a distant heaven. That's not Paul's primary thinking. Here was his primary thinking. He believed that what he was doing was a coming together of heaven and earth in this great act of renewal that God was doing, in which human bodies were likewise united, heaven and earth together. And our bodies were renewed so that we could live in that renewed place. So what Paul believed he was doing, and as we work through his life, we will see how he gets all this from the Old Testament. What Paul believed he was doing was that heaven and earth were being united in Jesus Christ. The kingdom of God had come to earth in Jesus Christ. There was now a joining of heaven and earth together. And that when people were saved and changed and became followers of Jesus Christ, they were entering into that new creation. They were entering into that kingdom of God, and they would be resurrected one day so they could be in it forever. Paul was not thinking, I got to get people to say a sinner's prayer so that they can go to heaven when they die. That was not his focus. Was not his goal. This idea of new bodies and new creation, it doesn't just mean that the destination of the eternity changes. In other words, I don't want us, and as we talk about new creation all the time in here, we talk about new earth all the time. I don't want us to think that what Paul wants us to do, instead of thinking, that when Jesus comes back, he's going to gather us all up and we're going to go someplace else and be there forever. No, he's going to come back here, we're going to get resurrected, and we're going to stay here on the new earth forever and ever and ever. Okay, now that's true. But it's not just about a destiny change, right? Where the destination, the location of this destination is changed. It also changes the way we live now, if we believe that to be true. Amen. That's what Paul, his whole ministry was about. Getting people to understand, here's what God is doing by joining heaven and earth together. That means that the way you live now changes because you're going to be here forever. And that matters. Everything changes along with it. So, number one, do not think Paul as being converted from Judaism to Christianity. And do not think the goal of Paul's ministry is to get people to go to heaven when they die. But he's getting them to understand what Jesus did by bringing the kingdom of God to earth. What the new creation is all about. Once we get these two things clear in our mind, we can gain a historical perspective in three different senses, three different areas. All right, I didn't put these in your notes, but if you want to jot these things down, these would be good things to jot down under a proper historical perspective. Number one, when we view these two things rightly, we begin to see that it matters to try to find out what first century Paul was actually talking about. History, anytime we do history, we're trying to get in the minds of the people in the past, aren't we? That's what we're trying to do. What was George Washington thinking when he decided to cross the Delaware? And that's what we do. Well, if we want to get what Paul is trying to say to us, then what we have to do is we got to go back to first century Christianity. We have to go back in history. And we got to understand the things that were going on then. Because what is so easy for us to do is to read our Bible, forget completely the context by which that was written, and just apply it to our lives today. When we do that, so often we misapply the Bible. We make applications to our life that really have nothing to do with what was being said. Number two, when we start to appreciate what Paul was really talking about, we find that he was himself talking about history and what happens in the real world. So what happens is, as we say, okay, we're going to look at Paul and the history in Paul's life. So then we go back to Paul, and then we see that what Paul is doing is actually talking about history. Over and over and over again, Paul is saying, here's the history of creation. Here's the history of the Jewish nation. He actually goes back in his teachings and writings in history to bring everybody that's listening to him to the present. He was a Jew who believed creation and the intention of creation was a new creation. His gospel of salvation was about Israel's Messiah inheriting the world as was promised. What God had done in and through Jesus was launching a heaven and earth movement, not simply offering otherworldly hope. Paul's ministry was a heaven and earth movement. a new way to think about heaven and earth, a new way to think about humanity. And number 3, therefore, as Paul was concerned, his own historical context and setting mattered. The world he lived in was the world into which the gospel had burst. The world the gospel was challenging, and the world it would transform. Paul saw himself as living at the ultimate turning point in human history. And church, he's right. Paul lived in this place where the Jewish age was ending and the Christian age was picking up. He lived in that overlapping time right there. Paul lived in the turning point of human history. And that's how he saw his life. That's how he saw his ministry. He saw himself as being in this transitional period of time. And he saw his ministry as a way of bringing people into this new thing that God had done. And how important it was. I want to spend most of our time tonight talking about Paul's world. All right? Everything that I've shared with you up to this point was just kind of a brief introduction of laying some framework for us going forward. Do not think of Paul as converting from Judaism to Christianity. Do not think of Paul's goal of getting people off the earth and into heaven. No, instead, we have a historical perspective of heaven and earth coming together. We will do a lot of history in this series because that's the only way to go back and look at Paul's life. And what I want to do now is I want to talk about Paul's world. When we try to understand Paul, we have to do the hard work of understanding the context in which Paul lived. Paul lived in a Jewish world and a multifaceted Greco-Roman world. It was a Greco-Roman world of politics and religion and philosophy. Like, that's how Paul grew up. Paul was this devoted Jewish boy and man who was surrounded by the Greco-Roman religion, the Greco-Roman philosophy and political system. The Jewish world into which young Saul grew up was itself firmly set in the center of this Greco-Roman world. You think about it, right? All the customs, all the traditions, all the rituals, all of the celebrations, everything that we read about in the Old Testament, Paul's family and Paul himself would have been devoted to. I mean, hardcore devoted to it. The issue is that you lived in a world where Rome dominated everything. Where the Roman gods ruled, where Caesar ruled. And as much of ancient history, we do not know as much as we would like to about the city that he grew up in. Tarsus was the name of the city that he grew up in, and we do not know as much about it as we would like to. One of the reasons why, and you'll see from some of the pictures that I'm going to show you in a minute, is because there is a city sitting on ancient Tarsus right now. So it's very difficult to do excavations and stuff because there's a person living on the land. And you can't be like, excuse me, we're going to dig all this up, so we just need you to shush and go somewhere else. Can't do that. And so there hasn't been a lot of things that have been turned up from this time in Paul's life simply because there's a city on ancient Tarsus right now. But we do know enough to kind of get the picture of what it would have been like. Tarsus is in, you can put that map up. So here's Tarsus right here. This is Turkey. So what is present day Turkey is this right here. And Tarsus is sitting, it's right on a river that comes inland. There's a 10-mile inland river, and that's where it's located in southeast corner of modern Turkey. That's where he grew up. All right, so here you can see Jerusalem. So there's how far he was from Jerusalem. And this map, by the way, this map will come up over and over and over again each week. Next week, I'll try to draw lines from like Jerusalem to Damascus. That's what we'll focus on next week. And so this map will be a recurring thing that we see over and over again. And at some point, we're either going to head over here to Rome as we get further and further along. Let me show you a couple of pictures of at least some of the things that have been discovered in Tarsus. You can put that first slide up. So this picture here is actually a Roman road leading into Tarsus. So as you would go up the Roman road, probably from Antioch on over, this would be a road that you would take, and this would be a gateway you would come up and you would overlook the city. You can go to the next slide. They believe that this was part of the gating system of the city itself. So you would probably have multiple of these all the way throughout the city. But if you wanted to enter into city proper, you would travel that road we just saw. You would go through that first little gate, and then you would come in here, and you would come through the gating system here. The only other place that we really have any kind of excavation that's done is this one road inside the city. You can go to the next picture. This is an actual paved road that Paul would have walked on. But you can see, looks like there's a school over there. You can't do a whole lot of excavating. Excuse me, all you third graders, we need y'all to get up, pack it up, and move. We're going to do some more digging. But this is an actual road. I have another picture that kind of shows this from a different perspective. So here you can see that schools would be back over there to the right. But here's this paved road that the Romans made. And you can see some of the things on the right and the left. But Paul would have walked, I kind of picture this in my head, he would have walked that Roman road through that original gate into his hometown, through that gating system. He would walk these roads inside of the city where he lived. Tarsus was a very, very unique city. It could trace its history back 2,000 years. Alexander the Great, Julius Caesar, had recognized it as a very strategic, important place. And Emperor Augustus had given it special privileges. All right, all of these leaders recognized the significance of a city like this being right on the water and right 10 miles up the river. The importance of this as a strategic place to base camp and things like that. It was a city of culture. It was a city of politics. It was a city of philosophy and industry. This was, we use the term, what's the word I'm looking for?
Cosmopolitan.
Yeah, it was kind of like a cosmopolitan area. I mean, you had, a influx. You had a Jewish people that were there, and then you have all these Roman people that were there, and philosophy would go on, and industry would go on, and religion would go on. This was a happening city, all right? This was a city where a lot of things happened, and it was a city ruled by Rome. Now, when I said, you got to remember how Rome worked, right? Rome wanted you to worship their gods. They wanted you to worship who they worshipped. Everyone in Saul's day, in the regions from Rome to Syria, had to worship the goddess Roma and Lord Caesar, the Son of God. Okay, so that everyone was required. You have to worship Roma and you have to worship Caesar. Those are the two people you have to worship. So if you lived in these areas, you had to do what these cults told you to do. However, the Romans had struck a deal with the Jews. I think the deal had to be struck because the Jews were very firm in sticking with their ancestral traditions. Where other people may have been wishy-washy and they would flop around and stuff, the Jews weren't. The Jews were like, this is what we're going to do. This is why we got to do it. And so eventually there was a deal that was made because the Jews were relentless. And here was the deal. The Jews would worship and pray only to Yahweh, the God of their ancestors. However, they proposed to Rome that we will pray to our God for Rome and for Caesar. So let us worship our God, the one true God of our ancestors, and we're not gonna budge on that. And to keep the peace, right? To keep things moving as they should to not bog down everything, live and let live kind of deal, Rome decided we will let the Jews worship their God. But the Jews in turn would say, but we are going to lift Rome up in prayer, and we're going to lift Caesar up in prayer to our God. So this proposition took place. This would have been the world that Paul grew up in. Paul grew up in a world where he was a devoted Jewish young boy. And Rome had made a deal with his religion. Rome had made a deal with his people. Paul and his family belonged to the strictest of Jewish schools. They were Pharisees. Okay, now we know all about Pharisees just from studying the New Testament and stuff. Paul and his family were Pharisees. Pharisees lived with a fierce strictness in obedience to the ancestral traditions and the Torah, and they urged everybody else to do the same thing. But don't think that you have Jews on one side and non-Jews on the other side, and that was the complete structure, right? So you've got Rome and you have the Jews. No, because inside the Jewish tradition, you had a bunch of different subsects. You had the Sadducees, you had the Zealots, you had the Pharisees, you have the Essenes, you had all these groups, these Jewish groups, these subgroups living together, and they disagreed about all kinds of stuff. So you had Rome, and then you had the Jews, but then all these Jews that kind of viewed things differently. Now, we can't be sure how Saul and his family lived, but there are a few things we can be sure about. He lived in a very different culture than we do. We can all agree on that, right? A very different culture than what we live in now. There was really the whole Roman world, because of the way they lived, there was no such thing as private life. Okay, we're used to, in America, having privacy and having a private life. There was no such thing really this time period. Everything was done in an earshot of everybody else. Houses would have been, literally back to back. You could have reached out a window and reached across the way and held your friend's hand out their window. That's how close you could have been. Everything was pushed together. Streets were narrow, houses were cramped, noise and smell everywhere, and everyone knew everyone else's business. How'd you like to live in that society? Right? There is no privacy. Everybody knows everybody else's business.
That's small town life.
All right? So the question as to how one lived with the ancestral code, the Jewish ancestral code, and following the Torah, this was not a theoretical question. This was very much lived out in front of everybody. There was no, we're strict Pharisees, and then you could play the game and act like you were a strict Pharisee, but then not really be. Everybody wasn't everybody's business. If you said you were a strict Pharisee, people would know whether or not that was true. They'd see how you lived, and they would know it. It would be lived out in full view of all the neighbors. This also applied to the workplace. Okay? We're spread out. Right? We got DFW, and then we have all the suburbs, and your business could be located 30 miles from your home, and it's in a private building that gets locked up at night and needs security guards to come, and so everything's that's not the way this was done. Business was done sometimes right out of the home. Business was done right out in the streets. Whatever occupation you had, mainly it would be done right within this cosmopolitan area. There was no privacy even when it came to the workplace. Now, we know from Paul's later life, what was Paul's job? He was a tent maker, wasn't he? He was a tent maker. This makes complete sense given what we know about Tarsus. Number one, he probably learned tent making from his father. It's the way that it worked. So his dad was probably a tent maker as well, and taught his son at a young age. Jewish boys would usually start going with their father to work at usually around the age from 6 to 8 years old. So the way you would start learning your profession and your trade around 6 to 8 years old, you would go with your father. So can you just picture little Saul, 6, 8 years old, right, living in Tarsus, this cosmopolitan area, knowing that his family follows the Torah and we follow our fathers, going to work every single day with his dad, learning how to be a tent maker, how to work with the industry, within the industry of his family. We don't know if his father was a Torah scholar or teacher, though most historians believe that he probably was, and that's why he had to be a tent maker, was because being a scholar and a teacher in the Pharisee tradition didn't get you paid. You didn't get paid to do that. So you had to have a job where you got paid to support your family, even though you were a scholar and a teacher. And the reason why many of them believe that is because they believe wholeheartedly that Paul's education started at home. That Paul's education of the Torah and of Judaism and the ancestral traditions started at home with his father. That his father not only taught him tent making, he taught him how to be a good Pharisee. He got that from his dad. Another important aspect of tent making, all right, would have been the people that he ran into. You got to remember, this was a place where people would come, they would stay for a while. This would be a place where Roman battalions would come in, they would stay for a while, then they would pack up and they would move through. It is very possible that the market for tents would have been very, very wide. Purchasers would have come from all kinds of people in Tarsus' busy world, including regimes and battalions of Roman soldiers. We can safely assume that Paul grew up in a cheerful, strict Jewish home, but at the same time lived within a multicultural, multi-ethnic work environment. So at home, it's Judaism. It's Pharisee. It's strict obedience to the Torah and the ancestral traditions. But we go to work, we're encountering people. It wasn't just Jews that bought tents, right? He is encountering all kinds of people coming to buy tents that him and his father make. Engaging with these people, knowing these people, interacting with these people. We know from mature Paul that Paul could speak several different languages. We know from the mature Paul that at some point, and I believe it started at home, he learned how to swallow the Bible whole. Paul was an expert in the Old Testament. That's important going forward, by the way. It's going to be very important going forward. Paul was an expert at the Old Testament. I believe with all my heart this started in Tarsus. This started when he was a kid. He learned this stuff in his home, and then he saw at the workplace how that strict Pharisaical obedience to the Torah was going to interact with people of different ethnicities than him, different religions than him. Later we read that Paul can move with ease from Genesis into Psalms, from Deuteronomy into Isaiah. He knows how the whole story works. He knows the ups and downs of the Old Testament. He knows all the twists and turns. He is an expert in the Old Testament, and this would have started when he was a child. I mentioned to you that one of the things that we would see a lot in Tarsus would be philosophy. The Greco-Roman world was big on philosophy. Plato and Aristotle and those that had come before, these traditions were so worked into the fabric of the Greco-Roman world. It would have been impossible for Saul, working as a tent maker, not to encounter people and not to encounter all these different philosophies. Would have been impossible for him not to know these ideas in the Greco-Roman world. We don't know that he read Plato and Aristotle. We don't have any proof of that. But we know from his writings that he definitely knew about the ideas. He could use those ideas to make his points. He knew what the philosophers taught. He knew how the philosophers thought, and that rhymed. And he would do. That all began, I believe, as a child. Think about it. He would go and he would study the Torah. He would study the Old Testament at home. Then he would go with his dad at 8, 10, 12 years old. He would go with his dad to work, and he would see all of these people coming to buy tents that had this philosophy. He might have overheard his dad having interactions with somebody who believed in some of these philosophies. And he watched how his dad, using the Torah, would have conversations about how these philosophies posed against the Jewish religion. And so all of this would be worked out right in front of him. Paul probably talked about all this with his family members, just like we do. He probably discussed what was going on in the world and philosophical ideas and Judaism and the Torah and the story. Paul, as a result of this, Paul was completely at home in both a Jewish culture and a non-Jewish culture. And that is huge for us moving forward. Paul could be around the Jewish people and fit in and get it. Paul could be around the philosophers and fit in and get it. That is huge moving forward for Paul's ministry. Now I want to end tonight with what I'm calling the Jewish story. This will be the springboard for next week. This is very, very important, and I want us to really understand this in order for us to really grasp what's going to happen to Paul on his way to Damascus. This is the story of Israel as a whole. This would have been the story that Paul knew like the back of his hand. There are signs all across Jewish writings that the Jews did not see their Bible primarily as a bunch of rules and dogma to be followed. Instead, they saw it as a single story rooted in the books of Genesis and Exodus and in Abraham and Moses. It was a narrative rooted in creation and rooted in covenant. And it stretched all the way into the unknown. Really the dark unknown. And the reason I say the dark unknown is because everywhere you look in the story, you see Israel not obeying God. And as a result, what does God do? He gives them over to the foreigners. This is the story over and over and over again for Israel. It is not following God, captivity. Exodus, not following God, captivity. Exodus. Take the book of Judges, for instance. We don't think of the book of Judges as being a book of Exodus, but guess what? It is Exodus over and over and over and over and over again. What happens is they don't worship God, they do what's right in their own eyes, God gives them over, and then they have an Exodus out from the hands. They're delivered. Exodus brought out. Then it happens again, and it happens again, and it happens again. Of course, we know the famous one, the two big famous ones, right, is Egypt and Babylonian captivity, where they go into Babylonian captivity for 70 years. And for 70 years, they're begging God to bring them out. And finally, God does, brings them out, and they come back to Jerusalem. And we have, over and over again in Jewish writings, a lot of them extra-biblical Jewish writings, that the Jews still saw themselves, even after they came back from Babylonian captivity, they still saw themselves awaiting great restoration. Do you remember when they came back from Babylonian captivity and they rebuilt Jerusalem and the temple? Do you know what doesn't happen? What we never hear about happening? That the presence of God came and filled the temple up. The glory, and they were longing for that glory again. And it didn't happen. It didn't happen. Remember the first time when the glory fell upon the temple? the temple, the scribes and the priests and stuff, they had to actually get out of the temple. The presence of God filled it up so much, they were like, we can't even stand to be in here. We got to get out. Well, when they rebuilt the temple in Jerusalem after Babylonian captivity, that didn't happen. And there is a sense in which Israel was awaiting. They believed they were in spiritual exile and they were waiting for God to bring full restoration. Nehemiah 9:6. I want to read you this verse. This is an important verse to kind of show you how they saw themselves. Nehemiah 9:6. Listen to this. You, O Lord, you alone, you have made the heavens and the heaven of heavens with all their hosts, the earth and all that is in it, the seas and all that is in them, and you preserve all of them. The host of heaven worship you. You, O Lord, am I right on that? It's either 9:6 or 6:9, guys. Just freeze. 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 Oh man, I'm so mad at myself right now, guys. Stink.
What does it say?
They call themselves slaves still. So they get out of Babylonian captivity, they come back, they rebuild the walls in the temple, and they still call themselves slaves. Because they did not see themselves as being fully exiled out yet. And they did not see themselves as fully being restored. They were still waiting for something to happen. Now, we don't have time to go into all of that. But here's what I want you to understand. In Daniel chapter 9, we have language of 70 years times 7. 490 years. And here's what Jewish scholars would do. They would work the math, all right, in Daniel chapter 9. They would work the math and they would calculate, because they knew something great was going to happen. 490 years, they knew something's going to happen. And so they worked all the years up to the day that the first century. And what the Jewish people believed is that God was going to do something amazing in the first century. Now I want you to understand what that means. The Jews believed that in the first century, that's when God was going to do this amazing thing that they were waiting on. They didn't get it after Babylonian captivity after they were freed. They said 490 years, that's when God's going to do it. That's when God is going to do it. And it's drawing very close and it is very near. And if the time was near, then guess what the Jewish people had to be about? Following the Torah. They could not mess around. They couldn't be like, we'll just mess around and not really follow the Lord that much, but we want God to do this great thing. No, they realized our ancestors blew it. Like they worshipped idols over and over again and they never got to see it. 490 years, it's upon us, it's near, it's coming. We got to be serious about doing what we got to do. That's important for next week, by the way. So in Paul's day, strict obedience to the Lord was needed in order to be delivered out of this spiritual slavery. This would mean a focus upon the temple. This would mean a focus upon the Torah, because they were praying for God's divine presence to come upon the temple once again. This had not yet happened, and they were waiting for it to. And they were expecting it to happen soon. The two greatest symbols of Jewish life, the temple and Torah, pointed to the story in which devout Jews, like Paul's family, would have believed that God was fixing to pour out His glory in a fresh way. If you have not already put the pieces together, we will do that for you next week. Those that knew the Psalms, they would sing about it. This new thing that God was fixing to do. This fresh thing. The completion of the Jewish story was about to happen. They were waiting for it. They would sing about it. They would pray about it. They would hope for it day after day and month after month. 490 years, it was upon us. It's here. It's fixing to happen. And that is what the Jews were waiting for. And that sets us up for Paul's encounter with Jesus on the road to Damascus. And what Paul is going to find out is that they had calculated pretty accurately. God did send His glory down in a fresh, new way. But it wasn't anything that anybody was expecting.